Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us here today. Today we have Dr. Simone Moody from Children's Mercy in Kansas City joining us here today to discuss different strategies for supporting student executive functioning. This work is being supported by the Munroe-Meyer Guild, associated with the Munroe-Meyer Institute. And this series is being offered in collaboration with the School-Based Mental Health Collaborative, which is a collaborative in the Omaha area, focusing on how to continue to support and improve school-based mental health services. We have two more sessions coming up. So we have one on April 20th at 11:30 a.m., where we'll be discussing how to support youth with depression. And then we also have one on May 16th at 10:30 a.m., where we'll be discussing how to support social skill development and navigating peer conflict. So we have a lot of awesome presentations coming up. So be sure that you keep your eyes peeled for details regarding those. And before we jump into this, I want to give a brief overview about Dr. Simone Moody. We are so lucky to have her here today. Dr. Simone Moody is a clinical psychologist and director of psychological services for the ADHD specialty clinic at Children's Mercy, Kansas City, and is an associate professor of pediatrics at the University of Missouri, Kansas City School of Medicine. She provides evidence-based care for youth 3 to 17 years old with ADHD and related conditions to improve functioning in their everyday lives, including at home, school, and social settings. Dr. Moody serves as a member of Children's Mercy School-Based Health Task Force and on the board of the Kansas City chapter of the national organization Children and Adults with ADHD, or CHAD. Dr. Moody teaches school personnel, medical professionals, psychologists in training, and parents about evidence-based practices for youth with ADHD. She's also involved in program development and research. Thank you so much, Dr. Moody, for joining us here today.
Okay, well, thank you all for inviting me here to present on strategies to support student executive functioning. I'll start by giving you all an overview about our talk today. We're going to start with some foundational information about what executive functioning is, how it develops. We're going to talk about the relationship between executive functioning, ADHD, and self-regulation. And once we have those foundational skills and information, we'll talk about what you can do to support your kiddos with executive functioning challenges. And for the purposes of my talk, I'll be focusing on ADHD. We know that ADHD impacts kids and adults in lots of different settings, including school, but also at home and socially. But for my talk today, I'm going to focus and go a little bit more in depth on the school side of things. I know many of you submitted questions when you registered for this presentation today that touch on different areas of functioning for kids with ADHD, and I will certainly answer those when we get to the Q&A portion of the talk today. I'll also provide some resources to help you get more information if needed once our presentation is done. We're going to go ahead and start with a polling question. So I want to get to know my audience. Since I can't see you, I'd like to hear from you to see which level of schooling your child attends. And if you have children at different levels of schooling, just select the level that you're most interested in learning about, or the one that best applies to a kiddo with executive functioning. Okay, I see we're getting some responses in here. It looks like a little bit of a mix. Okay, and it looks like we have about 50% of you with kiddos in elementary school. The next level we see here is high school, and then a smaller portion in middle school. We don't have any preschool age caregivers or pre-kindergarten caregivers, which cuts out a chunk of what I could talk about. So that is helpful information to know. All right. We're going to start by talking about what executive functioning is. Over to the right, I have a picture of the brain, and you can see that blue region is the frontal lobe or frontal portion of the brain, and that circle here is where we see most of our executive functioning occurring. So back in the 1970s, Carl Pribram, a neurosurgeon and a brain behavior researcher, was first to coin the phrase executive functioning. And he talked about the prefrontal cortex, or this area of the brain here, as being the executive of the brain, which organizes and processes information to help guide behavior. So this laid a good foundation for our understanding of what executive functioning is. However, the definition was pretty broad, which led to lots of inconsistencies in how we define executive functioning, how we measure it, and how we understand it. So more recently, researchers such as Russell Barkley, who's a researcher and a clinical neuropsychologist, I call him the godfather of ADHD because he's just been a pioneer and a real trailblazer in the field of ADHD, defines executive functioning more specifically. So he talks about executive functioning being self-directed actions needed to choose goals and to create, enact, and sustain actions towards those goals. So he talks about these processes really involving or being managed by the self, and also working towards goals that are in the future and not just in the now. He talks about executive functioning having to do with self-regulation in order to achieve the goals that you have. And we'll talk a lot more about that as the presentation goes on. He also talked about other layers of processes that really work with yourself to help guide and influence your behavior. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. So when we're thinking about how this relates to kids at school, we might think about what are the core self and future-oriented actions that really need to take place in order to complete something like a homework assignment or study for a test or get a good grade in a class. And if you think through the processes that are involved in doing that, you can come up with a lot of different things, which is why we see, executive functioning just really impacts so much when it comes to school and other areas of life. We also know that executive functioning doesn't just happen in the prefrontal cortex alone, but it does interact with different networks of the brain and different areas of the brain to help guide our behavior. And this theory is supported by brain imaging studies. So we know that there are different networks that support our self-awareness and our self-monitoring, the WHO network. We know that there's the what network, or the ability to be aware of or the ability to take information and keep it in your brain and remember that information to help guide your behavior. We know that there's a when network that's, again, also affiliated with the prefrontal cortex that influences the timing of when we do things and our time management skills. And we also know that there's a why network that integrates with the prefrontal cortex to help us make decisions based on how we feel and how motivated we are, and is a final step of what we choose to do. We know that executive functioning is a developmental process. So it's not just there, from birth, and it doesn't just come across or develop just in adulthood. We see it develop starting in infancy, with a full developmental process ending around 25 to 30 years old, approximately. We know that our executive functions develop very much in a stepwise manner. So we need the lower level steps in order to be able to build upon higher level steps that are referenced in this picture or this diagram here. We also, and we'll go into each one of these in just a second, but we also know that, developmentally, we go from external control, so relying on others to help us with our executive functions, to being more independent and future thinking on our own and internalizing some of these processes. So it's a slow, gradual process that starts in infancy. Right here, starting on the left side of the screen, you can see the first executive function that starts developing is our self-awareness or our self-monitoring. So paying attention to yourself and what you do. I always think of a little infant finding their feet for the first time and just being aware of their body in space and that they might be able to control what they do. Next, we move on to developing our self-restraint, often referred to as inhibition. So I think about, a toddler learning to stop when you tell them no, or an infant learning some of those skills, or a toddler that's learning those basic safety skills that we're trying to teach them to not run out in the middle of the street. And next, we move on to developing our working memory, and we can break these down into nonverbal working memory, which essentially is visual imagery. So we, understand information and work toward our goals based on images that we have in our brain that helps us remember what has happened in the past and what might happen in the future, and helps us remember a time sequence and how things go. So I think about, a child in daycare or in preschool that's first learning that, hey, at the end of the day, my caregivers, my parents are going to come pick me up, and being able to picture that and understanding that through their experiences and their understanding of time. Or my 4-year-old understanding that if she stays in her bed all the night, she might get a treat in the morning, and being able to hold that picture in her memory to help guide her behavior to decide whether or not she's going to stay in her bed. Next, we move on to developing more verbal working memory. So not only do we have pictures that help us remember and guide our behavior, but we associate language with those pictures. We have this internal self dialogue that helps guide our behaviors. So as an adult, as you're walking to work, as you logged on to this presentation, likely you were having some sort of self dialogue with yourself. And that starts to develop at a young age, and becomes an internal process. So at first we see it being very external. You see, kiddos who are young, talking to themselves as they play, talking to themselves as they pretend to read or pretend to do different things. Whereas older children, like my 7-year-old, is starting to internalize some of those processes. I see her, reading to herself and playing in a more quiet fashion and not having to act out or talk about everything that she does. Next, we move on to self-directed appraisal, which includes our emotion regulation and our motivation. And again, this starts out as very much being an external process where kids might not be so motivated to make sure you get to work on time in the morning, but then can kind of shift into more of an internal process, or at least that's the hope, as you get older. So learning to inhibit or moderate your emotions, and learning to be self-motivated without rewards or other external reinforcers. And finally, we get to the executive functioning of self-play or planning and problem solving. So being able to play mentally with different situations and create novel solutions to problems. And that's where a lot of creativity comes from, and learning how to do that independently is part of, transitioning to adulthood when we think about executive functioning. Another consideration along with development is this idea of a time horizon. So we know that kids aren't just little adults. Their brain development influences what they need, their behavior, how they understand the world. And this is true when we think about time and self-directed actions. So the ability to self-regulate your behavior toward a goal is limited roughly by the time windows that I have listed below based on a kiddo's stage of development. So infants are really only able to plan and direct their behavior maybe a few hours in advance. And you can see that children, it might be only 1 or 2 days, and even teenagers can only think about things and, have this goal-directed behavior independently, maybe a few days or a week. So this is important to understand as we are setting expectations for our kids as parents, thinking about Should we expect a 9-year-old to regulate their behavior to complete their homework packet for the week? They may have a lot of trouble doing that, given that their, time horizon is limited to 1 or 2 days. Or thinking about if we expect a teenager to study for finals weeks in advance, that might be really hard for them to do, just based on that time horizon. Other important executive functioning considerations are understanding that our behaviors are shaped not only by ourselves and our executive functioning processes, but also by people that we interact with, and our cultural environment can influence what we do and how we um, change our behavior and how we learn over time. We also know that our executive functions are effortful. So there are other areas of the brain that tend to be more automatic, not as effortful. As we get into some of those more higher order parts of the brain, like the prefrontal cortex, it takes more effort to get those processes going. And we know that our executive functions have a limited capacity. So this is probably why, if you have a kiddo that struggles with executive functions, they are likely exhausted at the end of the day. Even if they don't struggle with executive functions, they're still learning a lot and can still be pretty pooped or tired at the end of the day. So it's important to remember that we might need a reset on some of these executive functions, and we might need some breaks in order to help us keep going. Moving on and talking about conditions that impact executive functioning. Of course, individuals with neurodevelopmental differences fall into this category. So that includes children and youth with ADHD, learning disorders, autism spectrum disorders. And like I mentioned, we're going to focus on ADHD, and I'll tell you why in just a minute. Also, executive functioning can be impacted by other behavioral health conditions, medical conditions, stress and adverse experiences, sleep deprivation. I think about coming home with a newborn baby and being sleep deprived, and understanding that had an impact on my executive functioning. Also, people who experience brain injuries, those are all scenarios and conditions that can impact our executive functioning. So why focus on ADHD? There are a few reasons, and we'll start with ADHD just being a very prevalent behavioral health condition, arguably the most prevalent behavioral health condition in children. We know that approximately 10% of children are diagnosed with ADHD, and that means that in every classroom, there's probably at least 2 children that have ADHD. So because of the vast majority of people with ADHD, it can be important to consider this condition in terms of how to treat it and how best to manage it. We also know that brain imaging studies show developmental delays directly in the areas that we know are responsible for executive functioning. So in that prefrontal cortex area. And we know that there are differences in how that area develops for people with ADHD and those without ADHD. So in this image to the right, you can see a picture of a brain, and the dark purple areas are parts of the brain, and you can see they're located primarily in that frontal cortex, or the prefrontal cortex region, that experience greater than a 2-year delay in terms of how that brain area matures. And the light purple is a 0 to 2 year delay. So we know that people with ADHD have delays in the areas that are responsible for executive functioning in the prefrontal cortex and the associated networks. So this explains why youth with ADHD may present as socially, behaviorally, and or emotionally immature. So a 7-year-old may have tantrums like a 4-year-old, and developmentally may be functioning more behaviorally, socially, and emotionally like a 4-year-old. We know that a 5th grader may need support with managing their assignments and materials more like a 2nd grader. So it's important to understand that there is a developmental delay so that we can shape our expectations for that child. And if we don't understand that, that can lead to a lot of frustration and a lot of negative interactions with your child. Moving on, I'll show you a video representation from the same study. You can see the brain on the left is represents youth with ADHD, whereas the brain on the right represents typically developing controls without ADHD. The video is going to start looking at brain development on average for kids that are 5 years old, and then it's going to advance to adolescence. And this study consisted of over 400 youth, again, with ADHD and without ADHD. And the video really depicts how that frontal cortex, or that prefrontal cortex of the brain, responsible for that higher order executive functioning, peaks later for children with ADHD on the left side than on the right side. So I'll play the video so you can see what I'm talking about here. You can see the right side is maturing faster, and this side here, as the age goes up, is just maturing a little bit slower here. Another reason to focus on ADHD. So if brain imaging and understanding the prevalence of ADHD didn't convince you enough to really focus on this when we're talking about ADHD and executive functioning, we can look at different models that have been developed to explain ADHD. And models have shown that theories of ADHD are supported, and that ADHD is really trouble regulating our behavior and trouble regulating our executive functions. So behavioral inhibition here at the top is a key ingredient to developing self-control. And we really need self-control in order to be able to use all of our other executive functions. So we need to be able to stop and think and slow down in order to regulate our behavior. But we also need to be able to stop in order to regulate our cognitive processes, or what's going on in our brain. So we'll talk a little bit more about each one of these executive functions as it relates to ADHD, and common problems that we see related to these executive functions in the next few slides or so. Finally, we know that our executive functions map directly on to core symptoms of ADHD. So when we think about ADHD, we have two main groups of symptoms. We have our hyperactive and impulsive symptoms, and then we have our inattentive symptoms. And we know that inhibition is directly related to those hyperactive and impulsive symptoms, whereas inattention is directly related to some of those other executive functionings that have to do with working memory, verbal and nonverbal, regulating emotions, and motivation, and planning and problem solving. Moving on, we'll take a little bit more of an in-depth view of behavioral inhibition. So that was that top part of our ADHD executive functioning model, and talk about how we might see that day to day for kids with ADHD in a school setting, how we might see people with ADHD have executive functioning challenges when it relates to inhibition. So first, we see problems with kids stopping before reacting and responding. So they might be rushing through assignments, not putting forth their best effort. They might give an answer before reading the whole question. They might have problems staying seated, being really fidgety or hyperactive. We also see problems with behavioral inhibition in terms of, again, slowing down to regulate those other executive functions. So that might look like problems transitioning to attend to maybe a task at school that they're not super interested in, like math or reading or all of the above. We might see kiddos shouting out in class instead of raising their hand. So these are all examples of ways that behavioral inhibition might be impacted for people with ADHD in a classroom setting. Working memory is a big one. So I just put some of the highlights in here. People with ADHD have trouble following multiple step instructions. So if you think about coming home from school, and if you tell your kiddos, all right, take your backpack off, take your shoes off, get your homework out, It might be really hard for them to be able to remember and not be distracted along the way, and be able to stick with some of those tasks that you give them. Problems shifting your attention from one area or one topic to another, problems with mental problem solving. So we think about doing a math problem in your head and being able to manipulate that information visually and verbally and be able to show your work for different assignments. Comprehension. So we know that comprehension of information and learning has a lot to do with our memory. If we're not paying attention to something, we can't remember it, and then it's going to be harder to recall. We know that time management is involved in our working memory processes. So we often see people with ADHD be poor with managing their time and just thinking that something's going to, take forever, or maybe they think that they can complete a task so quickly. We know that being aware of time and being able to manage a time is a big problem for people with ADHD. Writing things down when you're given verbal instruction can also be a big challenge because you're having to remember that information and manipulate it and then be able to translate and write that down in some way, which is why sometimes it can be challenging. For example, students to complete a planner or write down information that the teacher gives at the end of class. Also remembering to remember. So remembering to turn in your assignment the next day or get your planner signed in the evening. So those sorts of tasks can be really challenging for people with ADHD. Moving on, talking more about the verbal working memory or internal speech that we have. Again, we're going to see developmental delays in these areas for people with ADHD, which can account for things like blurting out in class or talking excessively, being loud, problems with organizing your thoughts. If you think about writing an essay and having to really organize how you're thinking about a story or putting together a story, thinking through different situations or problems that happen. Organizing your belongings can be really challenging. If you think about if you had a goal to, say, organize your desk, how would you approach that? You'd probably do a lot of talking to yourself about what steps need to get done and what that would look like. And if we're having trouble with that internal dialogue, you can imagine how that task would be really challenging. And then also problems sticking with tasks and routines. So again, the internal dialogue that you're having with yourself really helps guide your behavior. And if it's being interrupted or you're having trouble with it, it might be hard to stay on track. We also know that our emotion regulation and motivation is impacted for people with ADHD. So this might look like having big reactions to small problems, being easily frustrated. I often talk about going from 0 to 100 really quickly. Kiddos might have tantrums or meltdowns or outbursts, whatever you want to call it. I talk about those all the time in my office. Or you might see kiddos who are just really sensitive or easily upset. So again, just having trouble regulating or controlling your emotions. We also can see this on the flip side with kids being really, really excited about things and having trouble calming down. So it doesn't just have to be negative emotions. We know that motivation is impacted too. Maybe not so much for things that they really enjoy doing, which is interesting, but for things that are effortful, boring, too challenging, that are not preferred, we can see problems with motivation more so than people without ADHD. People with ADHD, in terms of executive functioning challenges, can have trouble starting tasks and finishing them. So they might, start one thing and then move on to something else and then move on to something else and just really have a hard time following through, as well as just starting them in general and maybe procrastinating somewhat. So we know that this can be impacted because of our executive functioning challenges when someone has ADHD. Finally, we have planning and problem solving. So thinking about having trouble generating alternative solutions to problems. So say your kiddo doesn't have a good grade at school, thinking about, well, how can we, make it better? And it might be hard for your high schooler to really navigate what they might need to do to make that happen. And that can be frustrating as a parent because, they're 15, they should know how to do this. But again, we have a developmental delay in the brain that makes these things harder. Also trouble with using skills to create new solutions to problems. We think about, as kids get older, having to do some problem solving, word problems that can be challenging. Thinking about tasks like creating a study plan can be really challenging. How do we manage to figure out how to study? How do we, plan our time? That can be very challenging. Also, completing longer term assignments like school projects. Oftentimes, I'll talk with kids and their parents in my office, and they'll talk about having a book report that they need to do, or maybe a project on a historical figure. And sometimes it's like, well, where do we even start? Well, who do you want to pick? Well, I don't know. There's lots of different options. So being able to navigate that and stay focused to help guide your behavior can be pretty challenging. Also, thinking about doing tasks like balancing activities that, say extracurricular activities you have with, school time. How do we plan our time and manage our time and, solve problems that might come up related to balancing our time? Okay, so we talked about all of the challenges, or at least examples of challenges in different areas that people with ADHD have as it relates to executive functioning. Now we're going to get to how to manage those challenges. So I'm going to start by talking about two main approaches to managing executive functioning deficits or challenges. And then I'll go into more detail in future slides and give you a step-by-step guide on what you can do as a parent to help implement some of these approaches. So first, we want to consider effort. So how can we make tasks less effortful? Again, we know that executive functioning takes up a good amount of effort in our brain. And for people who have more challenges, it's going to take even more effort. And we know that there's a capacity or a limit on that. So how can we really make tasks less effortful? So we want to think about things like our environment. How can we make our environment less stimulating? How can we reduce the noise, reduce the distractions to help focus? When we think about making tasks less effortful, we might think about chunking, steps of a task or parts of an assignment into smaller pieces. We might talk about taking a project and breaking it up into smaller steps to really make the expectations a little bit less, at least temporarily, and then introduce another step or another chunk just to make the task feel a little less effortful and to really narrow the focus for that task. We also want to think about giving your brain a little break. So it does take a lot of effort. We do have limited capacity. How can we schedule some short, structured breaks? When I say short, I mean, 1 or 2 minutes, not, 30 minutes, not playing video games. Bonus points if it includes some sort of physical activity, because that can also help stimulate the brain and the areas that are less active for people with ADHD. When we think about making things less effortful, I also think about routines and making sure that we are creating some good habits so it doesn't take as much of our effort to do it. So making sure we're getting good practice of these routines, and that as a parent or a caregiver, you are scaffolding their ability. So you are seeing, what are they capable of doing on their own, and what kind of support do they need to do these routines and to do these skills, and you're giving them what they need to make progress. And then you're gradually shifting that responsibility over time. Another big chunk of what we do to manage executive functioning challenges is to externalize processes. So if we know that, part of our problems with executive functioning, we have trouble internalizing some of these skills, how can we come up with external ways to lead us to the same goal? So we want to think about, especially for, high school students, end of middle school students, how can we offload the information that we need to remember? So 9 times out of 10, I talk to a high schooler, how do you remember that you have a test coming up? Well, I just know. Well, no, you don't. Remember last time you forgot. Nope, you don't remember last time. So finding tools to get that information that you need to have in your brain and put it somewhere else. Also finding ways to externalize time. So setting, alarms or using a visual timer. We'll talk in more detail about that in a minute. We also want to set expectations and review them, make sure they're realistic and review them visually. So having a visual representation of what needs to get done, and also reviewing those expectations verbally as well. We also, since we know that internal motivation might be weak for people with ADHD and executive functioning challenges, we want to find ways to increase motivation externally. So how do we do all this? I'm going to talk about 6 steps based on my experience as a clinician and my understanding of evidence-based tools for ADHD and executive functioning. We'll talk about 6 steps that you can use to manage ADHD and executive functioning challenges in the real world. So first step is to be in the know. And so as a parent, especially as your kiddo gets older, you might not be in the know. And so I always talk about the motto of G.I. Joe. If anyone remembers G.I. Joe's motto, it is knowing is half the battle. So I have G.I. Joe up here. So not knowing is the other half of the battle. And I'm sure a lot of you parents and caregivers out there can relate to that. So common problems that I hear in my office. I forgot about an assignment. I didn't have enough time to write it down. I lost where I put the information. Or maybe your kiddo remembers and they do know what they need to do, but they don't want to do it. Again, those motivational processes get in the way. So they might come home and say, I don't have any homework. And you think, okay, great. And then they go on and play, and then you realize they have a bunch of missing assignments. We also see more and more schools are using online platforms to assign assignments and to keep parents up to date, and also kids up to date on what they've done and what's missing. But oftentimes I'll see that there are some situations where the information that the child gets doesn't match up with what the parent gets, and maybe the teacher hasn't updated that information yet. So that can cause a lot of confusion. And so it's important to make sure that you're getting accurate information when we think about being in the know. So things that you can do, using a planner can be really helpful, but understanding that it's going to be really hard for kids to do that. Again, with more and more of these online platforms, it might even just be more of this support and with holding them accountable. So checking a planner, making sure that you know you have the information that you need to be able to help your kiddos with the tasks that they need to do. Also, increasing your communication with teachers. So I see even for high school students, sometimes we need to get more communication about what assignments they actually need to do, what's missing. The online platforms aren't exactly showing that for them. And so it's important to make sure that we are getting accurate information. Other things that you can do to be in the know are to ask questions. So ask teachers, or have your kiddos, if they're in high school, especially, what are the best ways to study? Seeing if there are extra supports at school. So, if your kiddos are coming home with unfinished work that they're having to do pretty frequently, how can we maximize their time at school? So are there extra supports that can help them get as much done as possible while they're at school? Because remember, they have a limited capacity, and when they get home to you, they're going to be pretty tired. Getting information about what does a study hall or guided study look like. So oftentimes in middle school and high school, we'll see these classes be offered, or sometimes they're even standard to a student's schedule. Sometimes they're just a social hour. So, making sure you're understanding what that looks like and really advocating for your kiddos to make sure that they are getting the support that they need, and that those accountability checks and that help with managing their assignments, planning and organizing that probably doesn't come naturally to them. Step 2 is developing routines. So there are lots of different routines that you can develop. I'm going to talk about some of the more common ones that I talk about in my practice, and you can see some picture examples over on the right. The first one is a backpack checklist. So if your kiddos are having trouble remembering to bring things home from school, this can be a helpful tool. So that's depicted in the top picture here. This is actually something that I did. I just took a note card, wrote down the things that need to go home: homework folder, planner, water bottle, jacket, lunchbox, put it in a snack Ziploc bag, took a little, pinned it on the inside of the backpack. So this way, when you open the backpack, the child can see, they have that visual cue, that external cue that tells them, these are the things that I need to bring home. And that helps them with that memory piece. And it's a lot of practice of doing this skill and having it be part of your routine. Other routines that you can get into are organizing a homework folder every day. So kiddos that I see will do sporadic checks of their belongings, have them bring in their backpack. And oftentimes, it's a big mess. There are papers crumpled up, not put in the right spot, put in between different things, maybe just lost or missing altogether. And so I really encourage families to get into a routine of, when we come home, we check our folders, we put things back in the right place, and getting in that routine again can make it less effortful and come a little bit more naturally to them. And on the right here, I just have a picture. This is actually my daughter's folder, and her teacher is very organized and has it set up already to where papers are put on the left to bring home, and on the right to bring back to school. We talked about this already a little bit, but making sure part of our routine is coming home. First step is checking our planner or checking those online platforms, checking a calendar to see, do we have upcoming tests? Do we have upcoming projects? So making sure we're doing that every day. Even if we think we don't have anything, it's a good skill to practice. And then once we have the information about what we need to do or what's upcoming, we can then get into the routine of scheduling time to complete those assignments and other school-related tasks. So if we know we have, soccer this day, Boy Scouts this way, dance this day, how can we plug in times to study for our tests that we have at the end of the week? When would be good, 30-minute chunks to schedule in our day? Or, if we know that we have these activities on these nights and the homework packets due at the end of the week, when can we work on the homework that we have? And then finally, thinking about routines, another big one that I talk about is getting all the stuff done that you don't want to do before the fun stuff. And so typically that's schoolwork. I have very few kids that I see who are really motivated to get their schoolwork done and really like doing schoolwork. Most of them do not. So making sure that, we are getting a little break after school, but we are also getting to our schoolwork before we do things that are highly preferred, like playing video games or watching TV or playing with a special toy. Step 3, thinking about how can we manage our environment. So I already talked a little bit about some external cues like that backpack checklist, but you might incorporate other reminder signs, other checklists of maybe what the routine's going to be. You can set different device alerts to remind your kiddo of when a certain activity is going to start or end, or a device alert that lets you know, hey, a reminder that you have an upcoming activity. Phones are really good for this for our older teens or kids who might have a phone or an iPad. For those of you who have devices like an Alexa or Google Home, that's been really successful. But you can just use a good old planner, good old calendar that you check regularly to make sure you're getting those cues. And then also things like visual timers can be really helpful. So you can see, this is the one that I own up at the top right, I got from Amazon, just to kind of signal how much time you have left to do an activity. When we think about managing the environment, we also want to think about our workspace. So where are we completing our work at home? If it is a teen in their room with their phone and the door closed, I don't know about that. I'm not sure much work is getting done. So really being mindful, if they have their desk in their room, they want to complete their work in their room, making sure the door is open, the phone is probably in another room of the house, or at least not right next to them, making sure we're doing regular accountability checks. If they're a younger kiddo, or even older kiddos that aren't doing their work in the room, which is helpful, maybe thinking, is there a kitchen table or a dining room table or a place in your home where they can be close to you so that they can be held accountable, but not too close to distractions. Making sure that, we're limiting, that's my next one here, limiting distractions, like have the TVs off, trying, maybe pets are distracting and we're moving them to a different room. Maybe we need to work on entertaining siblings that might disrupt some of the work that your child's doing at home. So we want to have a good workspace that's conducive to learning. We want to limit our distractions and make sure we are doing daily kind of organizational checks where we make sure we have all the materials we need in that area. We're going to move on and talk about setting realistic expectations next. And this is really key because oftentimes kids with ADHD can get really overwhelmed when they think about all the work that we have to do. So finding ways to chunk assignments into smaller pieces can be helpful. And they're probably going to have a hard time being able to do this on their own. So this is where you can be helpful and say, okay, you have 20 problems of a math assignment. Let's start with 2. And then we'll take a little bit of a break. And so that can kind of relieve some of that pressure or some of that, thought about this process being too effortful and make it feel a little bit more manageable. You can also help your kiddos and teens create small steps or small goals for studying or for long-term projects. So if they have upcoming finals or if they have a big project coming up, how can we chunk that up? Like, what pieces do we need to study and how can we plug in times to be able to do that, to make the goal more realistic and to prevent procrastination? And then in between those chunks or in between those steps, making sure we're having opportunities to take brief brain breaks. So again, ones that include physical activity are great. So even if it's jumping on the trampoline for a minute or going for a walk around the house or shooting some hoops in the backyard, or kicking around a soccer ball, or putting on a music, listening to a song and maybe dancing for a song, and then getting back to the next activity, playing with a pet. All things that kind of take your focus away temporarily from the school assignment, but don't completely get you off track, like watching TV, playing video games on a tablet. Also, thinking about how much time you're spending on schoolwork at home is really important. So you don't want to be spending your whole evening every day just working on schoolwork. And so if you are spending more than you think is fair based on what you've talked about with your teacher, or I always think about the rule of thumb of 10 minutes of homework per grade. So first grade about 10 minutes, second grade about 20 minutes, and so on and so forth. If you feel like it's taking significantly longer for you to complete work at home, it might be helpful to think about how can we reduce our workload temporarily, really focus on, limiting repetition and just being able to show that, hey, I know how to do this, maybe in 2 problems versus 10 problems. Thinking about having some accommodations that might help you have more realistic expectations. Step 5, we talk about scaffolding. So I mentioned this when we talked about our approach to ADHD, but it's really thinking about or knowing as the expert of your child where they're at, what their skill level is, what they're capable of doing on their own, meeting them where they're at, and then, scaffolding your support. So being able to support them at a level that they need and gradually challenge them over time. So again, you want to meet them where they're at, provide support. And once your child is successful, you might give them a little bit more responsibility and then monitor how they do. And then if they do well, you can give them a little bit more responsibility. We really want to celebrate their successes and help build their confidence over time during this process. So, for example, if you're sitting down and completing homework with your child, You might take the lead to see where they're at. If they're struggling, you might give them some report, say, okay, let's start by reading the directions. But, as you see that they start doing that on their own, maybe you can give them that responsibility to read the directions out loud, and then you help direct them to the problems. For older kids and teens that might have that piece down, the scaffolding might look like helping them come up with a study plan or helping them come up with a plan to get caught up on their assignments, and really seeing, what they're capable of doing, what they know on how to solve the problem, and how to give them the support that they need to reach their goal ultimately. And it's a long process of learning those skills. And so you're going to have to provide some support. So it's short-term pain for long-term gain. So we want to celebrate successes, give lots of praise, and we also want to limit attention to minor misbehavior. This is easier said than done, and usually is best tried with the support of a professional to understand that, kids can escalate quickly when we limit our attention to some of their disruptive behavior. But if they're arguing, whining, complaining, we're not really focused on that, but we're more focused on any step that they're making toward completing their assignment. Maybe it's sitting nicely in their chair, or reading the word problem, or being calm when they're frustrated with something. And then finally, we get to the reward component. So sometimes when we use the first 5 steps, we might see some success. But in times when we don't, it can be helpful to add a reward to NY to really increase our motivation. So we know that internal motivation tends to be weaker for people with ADHD and executive functioning deficits. So how can we build up those external motivators like rewards to help get them to use tools and skills? So we really use a reward as a tool to help develop skills. If your kiddo is already doing something, there's no need to reward them. But if it's something that they're not doing on their own, it can be a helpful tool, and it's likely going to be needed long term. So sometimes I'll work with families and they'll use tools and skills, and then they'll take away those supports, and the progress just goes away. And so in those situations, we might have to keep some of those rewards a little bit longer term. So examples of different reward systems might include an if-then contingency. So if you do this, then we can get this reward that you're excited about or motivated for. They can also include different token systems, and I'll show you examples of both of these. And I'll talk about just some of the more common ones that I tend to talk about with families. So first, when it comes to if-then contingency, so if you complete that checklist in terms of, coming home from school, reviewing your planner, working on your assignments for this amount of time, planning out your calendar, whatever it might be, then you can play video games once those things are done. Or then you get your phone back after school. So really finding ways to help kiddos and help teens stay focused on the things that they need to get done by externally motivating them. Another example is a token system. So I have poker chips up here, but it can be any kind of token, like a puffball. It can just be points. It can be marbles, whatever you want it to be. And you might think about breaking down each routine step. So this takes a little bit more effort than our if-then contingency. I usually like to start with the if-then contingency because it's easier to maintain. But if we're having trouble, we might break it down a little bit more, and maybe we are rewarding each step with tokens. And each token might equal something that they like to do. So I like to use screen time, since that's something that we want to limit anyway. How can we have them work and earn that for the things that we would like them to get done during the day? So you can see my example here of completing your planner, checking your planner, completing homework with 3 or fewer reminders, doing your 15 minutes of reading, and then we can adjust the value of those tokens based on how difficult it is for the child. So the easier activities might be worth fewer tokens, whereas the steps that are going to be more challenging can be worth more tokens. Another example I'll show briefly here is just a point system, and you can see each step of the routine is worth a certain value of points. And then you can trade in those points for a special snack, game time, or buying an app once they've accumulated a lot of points. So I will move on and put some of these skills together with some more real world examples. On the bottom, I listed the 6 steps that I keep in mind when I'm talking about executive functioning and teaching skills. And then we'll talk about other common issues that I hear from families. So one common one is a lack of motivation for schoolwork. Kids come home, they're pooped, they're vegging out on video games, and then they have a complete meltdown when it's time to transition to homework. And I know some of you are nodding your heads out there, even though I can't see it. Um, and so in these situations, we really want to think about maybe working on a good after school routine. So taking a short break, maybe having a snack, maybe doing some short physical activity of some sort, and then chunking our homework assignments into smaller pieces with those short structured breaks in between that are a minute or two, and then rewarding completion of whatever goal you set for them regarding their schoolwork with those video games. So they really have something to look forward to, which can help them work a little bit more efficiently. I think about especially our middle schoolers and high schoolers who come to me with lots of missing assignments and they're failing their classes. What can we do? So this is where the be in the know is really, really key, making sure that you are checking assignments daily, doing that together with your teens, making sure that you are setting goals for getting caught up on those assignments. And maybe that's how they earn back some of the privileges that they've lost for having missing assignments or failing grades and whatnot. Moving on, a big one I see is procrastination, especially on long-term assignments and studying. And this is where managing the environment can be really helpful, making sure they're not getting distracted or into things that are going to make them delay getting started, making sure that they are checking their calendar daily so they're paying attention to what's coming up. They're scheduling those little short sessions where they might be working on certain steps of a project or certain pieces of their studying can be really helpful skills to use in those situations. And then lastly, I have to mention this because it just happens so often. Oftentimes, kiddos with ADHD and executive functioning challenges have parents with ADHD and executive functioning challenges. We know that ADHD is highly heritable, and it's not uncommon for one or both parents to also have ADHD. So making sure that you are taking care of yourself, making sure that you are working together to manage your environment, that you are also using external cues so you remember to check in with your child at the end of the day to make sure you're holding them accountable. So being mindful of your own executive functioning and how that might impact your child is very important. Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit more about school-related accommodations. I'm not going to get into too much detail, but just want to give you an idea of what might be helpful to request or advocate for if your child is struggling with executive functioning challenges. Some of you might be familiar with different plans that your child might qualify for at school if they have, for example, an ADHD diagnosis or other diagnosis. They can qualify for certain accommodations that might help level the playing field to make it easier for them to manage their executive functioning in the classroom. And so there are 2 types of plans, the 504 plan and then an IEP, which is the IEP is more focused on challenges that are really impacting a student's learning, whereas a section 504 is a little less intensive that just, again, provides those accommodations. If your child qualifies for one of these plans, it may be helpful to request that a daily school to home report card be part of that plan. And I'll show you a couple of examples of that in just a minute, but it really does a good job of incorporating a lot of the tools and skills that we talked about today in terms of setting expectations, setting goals, chunking, our expectations, and making sure we're rewarding and reinforcing our progress toward our goals. We'll show you what that can look like in a minute, and I'll give you a resource that highlights that information. You also might think about preferential seating, so sitting close to the teacher or next to peer models to help limit distractions, breaking down large tasks into smaller steps. So just including some of the things that we talked about before into accommodations that they can get at school, scheduled or earned breaks. And this is a big one, assistance with assignment management, organization, and planning. So oftentimes schools will have a check-in, check-out system where a child or teen can check in with like a school counselor or homeroom teacher, just to, again, with that accountability piece, making sure they're staying up to date on their assignments. More often than not, I see kids and teens in middle school and high school with guided study halls or classes like a success skills class where they have an opportunity to get caught up on their assignments or get some of their work done. So really making sure that is part of your child's plan, or they're getting extra support during that time to keep them on track. And then I think about a reduced workload. So if your child is really having a hard time keeping up and you feel like it's too much, they're spending all their evenings and weekends doing schoolwork, how can we make it more manageable for them? Especially if your child has a failing classes, they're missing a ton of assignments. That is going to dig them into a hole that it's going to be very hard to get out of. So how can we temporarily at least reduce expectations moving forward? Okay. I went over this pretty quickly, but I want to move on and show you a couple of examples of a daily school to home report card. So this is a tool that teachers can use in the classroom if they're willing to. The times that teachers have used these tools in the classroom, it's been super helpful to the kiddos that I see with ADHD. It is an evidence-based tool for kids with ADHD, and the most common one that I recommend be used in the classroom. It's not just an accommodation, it really is an intervention. So we're setting goals for the child, for example, staying on task during a certain time of the day with 5 or fewer reminders, or completing at least 80% of your schoolwork. These are just examples. You might evaluate these behaviors at different time points during the day. For this example, I just included, morning and afternoon time points. And then the teacher is giving the child feedback, reminding them what the goals are, giving them lots of praise for staying on task and any effort that they're making toward their goals. And then they're deciding whether or not they met their goals. And they should be very objective, so that if I walk into the room, I would know if the child met the goals. And then each yes that they get is associated with some sort of reward. And you can see here that the rewards are tiered based on how many yeses they got. With the first yes, maybe they get extra paw points, the class-wide reward system at the school. They get a couple of those, whereas the last yes, they might get some paw points along with being able to do a special helper task or getting a prize bin reward. For our older kids, this is actually a daily report card that a school created based on some of the feedback that I gave for a particular middle schooler that I was working with. And I was like, wow, I was kind of blown away. I thought it was really awesome. And this child actually wasn't on any medicine for ADHD and did really, really well with this level of support in the classroom. So you can see how the child is evaluated on 3 different behaviors here: on work, completed assignments, or cooperating with a task. They're working on not speaking out of turn, keeping their body under control at each period of the day. It's broken up into a morning and afternoon goal. The child is awarded a 3 if they have met that objective with 1 or fewer reminders, a 2 with 2 or fewer reminders, and a 1 with 3 or more reminders. And then you can see if they meet their point goal for the morning, the child gets to choose whether or not he plays basketball or on an iPad for 10 minutes, and then same thing in the afternoon. Okay, so moving on and talking about resources, CHAD, or the organization Children and Adults with ADHD, is really our national resource center on ADHD. On that website, you can find lots of helpful information. There is a section on educational rights for children with ADHD. I know I just kind of briefly went over 504 plans and IEPs. If you want more information on that, you can find a lot of it here in this link. And also in that link includes a sample letter to request one of those evaluations if you think your child might qualify. Another highlight that I wanted to mention that is on CHAD, recently the University of Maryland developed tools for teens with ADHD, and a lot of it talks about organizational tools and time management. And so there are a bunch of short videos that you can look at with your teens if you're interested. And then finally, I have a link to a handout on a daily school to home report card. So again, I know I just glazed right over that, but if you're interested in getting more information on that, you can follow the link, and it talks about different target behaviors that you can focus on in the classroom, different reward options, and how you can implement a daily report card at school. Again, if your teacher is willing and able to do that. Finally, I list here some book resources. The first two are more general on ADHD management for kids and youth. And the last two are more focused on more of those like executive functioning, organizational planning skills.
I just wanted to say thank you so much, Dr. Moody, for all of that fabulous information. I feel like I learned so much. Super practical strategies too to help support students. But yeah, we have a few different questions that came in through the Q&A pod that I'm really excited to hear your response to. But I know we had some questions already kind of scattered in from those who registered. So we can maybe go on to the first question that we have ready. Are you okay with hitting the next slide, Dr.
Yep,
Moody?
got it.
All right. So the first question was, how is ADHD diagnosed?
Okay, well, I cheated and answered some of the questions ahead of time.
Perfect.
So ADHD, our evidence-based assessment or research-based assessment, the most accurate way to diagnose ADHD includes getting information from the people who interact with kiddos most often. So that oftentimes includes parents and teachers. So we want to get information on how many symptoms of ADHD those kiddos are having, and then oftentimes additional rating scales to see how or ADHD related problems might impact the child, or other information about their behavioral and emotional functioning. We want to make sure that we're getting information in multiple settings. So not just at home or not just at school, but both of those areas, or sometimes even extracurricular activities. So we want to get good rating scales, and then we also want to do a good, thorough clinical interview. And that would be a really targeted way to diagnose ADHD. Typically, pediatricians are able to do that. And so I would recommend starting there. If there are concerns for co-occurring conditions or other complexities, that's when a subspecialty evaluation from a psychologist or other mental health professional trained in assessment can be super helpful. They might have additional testing that they want to do to see if other conditions might possibly be causing some of the symptoms.
Very thorough answer. And I think it's exactly what I would say as well. And there was another question that popped in that is kind of related to this, but I can save it for later. But, I know that ADHD has been a really big topic of conversation on like mental health TikTok and things like that.
Mhm.
And so there was a question kind of related to that we'll get to as well. But awesome. Perfect.
Okay. Yeah, a lot of teens are coming in with that and wondering if they have ADHD. In those situations, I want to get information from more people, more teachers, and then make sure I'm doing a really thorough history to understand how that kiddo was like when they were younger, and just to see the pattern of symptoms over time.
Perfect.
Okay.
Right. So your 7-year-old daughter was just diagnosed with ADHD. What can I do to help her with impulse control?
So this is a loaded question, but I'll go back to like generally, how do we treat ADHD, right? And our American Academy of Pediatrics has guidelines on managing ADHD, and they recommend for kids 6 years and older, behavior therapy, which is what I do, and medication management. So those would be the two tools that I would recommend. Behavior therapy manages the impairments that are caused by the ADHD. So problems that we see at home and at school and social settings. So how do we work on better routines? How do we work on improving school-related functioning? All the things, or some of the things that I talked about today. We want to make sure, I have this graphic to the right here, that we're getting behavior therapy and not individual one-on-one talk therapy. So our behavior therapy is going to highly involve caregivers to make sure that we're teaching them skills and that they're using the skills and practicing the skills in between sessions. That's where the real magic happens. The other piece is medication management. And so medication directly targets these core symptoms of ADHD. So the inattention, the hyperactivity, and the impulsivity. It helps to activate the parts of the brain that are, what I say, a little bit sleepy for people who have ADHD in the prefrontal cortex. So those are our two primary treatments. And then I'll just go over really quickly for different age ranges, some more specific recommendations. So behavior therapy is recommended for all. It is harder to implement for kids who are 12 and older, just because naturally they're becoming more independent. So if we can get them earlier, that is great. And behavior therapy is also a primary treatment for children under 6. So the American Academy of Pediatrics recommends that children start with behavior therapy when they're younger, and we don't consider medication management until later. I'll jump ahead to the bottom. Medication we will consider for kids 6 and older. If they are younger than 6 and they're exhibiting lots of dangerous behavior, or they have really severe impairment that's not responding to strategies that you've tried, that's when we may consider medication sooner. And then finally, I'll jump to the middle. For our older children and teens, we can start working on organizational skills training. So that's a newer evidence-based treatment for ADHD. It's not rocket science. It's essentially using the tools and skills that we just talked about, a lot of times related to school, and just lots of repetition and practice and scaffolding to really make those skills more of a habit, and develop those areas that are weaker for people with ADHD.
Yeah, the behavioral therapy is just so critical, in looping in all of the stakeholders, pair or caregivers and
Mhm.
teachers. It really, when we can do that, it really, we can see the kids shine. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree.
What strategies do you have for an elementary classroom in which a student frequently is off task and cannot focus?
Yeah, so there are lots of different strategies that we can use. I just sort of highlighted the ones that come to mind most, and these should look pretty familiar because we talked about some of them. So really making sure we're limiting distractions, being in close proximity to the teacher, sitting next to peer models, not the other kids with ADHD, right? That can be a disaster, or their best friends. Making sure we're chunking assignments to make those tasks feel a little bit more manageable to them, to help them get started and keep on task with some of those assignments, breaking down those bigger projects, or even just writing a paragraph into smaller steps. Like, what are the things that we need to do? They might need that broken down a little bit more. Setting expectations, making sure we're reviewing the classroom rules with everyone is always helpful, but especially for that child that may be having more challenges, they may need more of a review. Using tools like the daily school to home report card. I can't recommend that enough. So I'd highly recommend that you look at that handout, and then finding ways to reinforce that child for being on task and for any effort that they're making toward completing their schoolwork. So lots and lots of praise, specific praise. I really like it how you're staying focused on your assignment and sitting quietly in your seat, and doing all the things they need to do to complete that task. And maybe even, of course, if you're doing a daily school to home report card, there's going to be a reward component. But you could even just, if you have a class-wide system at your school, you can just reinforce them with those tokens for doing the things that you want to do, maybe more frequently than kiddos without ADHD.
All right. I think just generally some difficulties with task initiation and focusing when moving to middle school. That's a pretty big transitional point, for having one teacher in elementary school and then moving into middle school where you have multiple teachers. That's challenging.
Yeah, that's one of the hardest transitions that I see
Uh,
for kids that I work with. Usually starting kindergarten is really hard, and then transitioning to middle school is really hard. So follow the steps. I think I did a pretty nice job of incorporating how you could adapt those skills for a middle schooler, but I will mention some common things that come to mind. So as you transition from elementary school to middle school, usually there's less communication with teachers. There's more teachers. So you don't have as much of that one-on-one communication. So you might, as a parent caregiver, need to advocate more and make sure that you are initiating some of that communication with the teachers. Also understanding that expectations are higher. So teachers are going to expect that, children are taking some initiative or being more independent. And we know that developmental delays associated with ADHD get in the way of that. So making sure that you are accounting for that in terms of your advocacy for your kiddo, and then also the support that you're giving them at home. Making sure that you are setting those expectations about what needs to be done and doing daily accountability checks to make sure they're staying on top of their assignments and they're staying organized, to prevent them from getting behind. It is so common for me to see, October of sixth grade, we, realize, oh my gosh, they have 15 missing assignments. And they had no idea. They thought the teacher would reach out to them. So make sure that you are staying on top of all of those things. And then again, to help with motivation, praising, rewarding all their efforts toward that bigger outcome of maybe getting good grades at school. So the little things that they're doing along the way to help make them successful.
I think you bring up a good point that not only is middle school a big adjustment for the kids, but also for parents and
Mhm.
having to coordinate that communication and navigate like a new maybe homework system. That is a lot to manage.
Yeah, for
Mhm.
sure.
All right. What's the best way to increase motivation in kids with ADHD? For example, toward completing homework, being involved in activities, etc.
Yeah, so we talked a lot about needing those external motivators. And when we're thinking about which ones to use, think about things that your child really likes, things that you approve of as parents and caregivers, and things that can't be earned other ways. So if your child gets free range on video game time, that might not be a good reward because it's not super salient and not as meaningful to them. So really thinking about what might be something extra special that they can earn. When it comes to motivation towards things like extracurricular activities, I like those to be child interest led. So, whatever your child's interested in is going to be helpful for them to, or easier for them to focus on and to pay attention to. So, making sure that those extracurriculars are within the realm of their interests, ones that they can be successful in too. Children with ADHD get negative feedback from everyone that they interact with, parents, teachers, siblings, so on and so forth. So really having an outlet and a setting that they can be successful with can really help boost their confidence and motivation. Finally, being mindful of timing. So if your child is on medication for ADHD, a lot of times activities are in the evenings. So making sure you're being mindful of medication coverage that might help your child be more motivated and successful in those settings.
Wonderful recommendations.
Thank you. The question was routines. That was the question. And I
Yes,
loved
yes.
it because I talk about routines all the time in behavioral parent training. That's like the number one thing that I talk about. We did talk about that a little bit in the presentation. I thought I'd include a picture of another Amazon plug chart that I've used at home for my kids for their morning and evening routine. It doesn't have to be that elaborate. It can just be pictures or, writing something down on a piece of paper. Reviewing those things visually and verbally every day. So it doesn't count to just have it there. You actually have to use it as a tool, making sure that we're externalizing time. So I mentioned I also have one of those little timers at home. So, and if my kids beat the clock, then they can, get a preferred activity at the end of the routine. So again, another if then contingency to help them. A big, big, big piece of routines in kids with ADHD is remembering the developmental delay. And so understanding that even though your child is 9, they may need support like a 6-year-old to get ready in the morning because of that developmental delay. So making sure that you are available, you're taking care of your needs so that you can best support and monitor your child. I promise you, they will eventually do their routines on their own. It's just going to take a lot more time for them to get there. So managing your expectations is super important.
All right. How do we help with flexible thinking or ability to adapt when plans or things change?
Yeah, so this is something that I don't always see for kids with ADHD, but commonly signals maybe there's some anxiety going on if we're having trouble adapting. Or sometimes it can be, autism spectrum disorder or obsessive compulsive disorder that may have some rigidity as a part of the executive functioning challenge. So I would encourage you to think about that. Again, anxiety is the most common thing. I included a book recommendation here. Freeing Your Child from Anxiety is a good resource. And there are lots of other ones out there that talk about you as a parent can help support a child who maybe has some rigid thinking patterns and some
Mhm.
anxiety. But you can also model being flexible. If there are situations where you see your child having an appropriate response and being flexible, making sure that we're giving lots of praise and attention to that. Oh, I really liked it how you stayed calm. I liked it how you went with the flow in that situation. Making sure that we're not giving too much attention to the meltdown that I anticipate might be occurring or the persistence that they might have on that thinking pattern. And then you can also start practicing at home. This is a scary thing to do. You might want the help of a professional, but on the weekend, if they're having trouble with, being flexible with the order of their routine, maybe you can practice doing things out of order and managing that response by, lots of praise for positive response and coping, and then not paying attention to a meltdown or minor misbehavior that we might see.
Mhm. And too, that like when plans or things change, that sometimes it's a positive, right? Maybe rather than watching, TV at home, we get to go out and eat ice cream instead. Having that
Yeah.
alternating that a change
Mhm.
sometimes is a positive, I think can be really helpful too.
Yes, I agree. It doesn't always have to be a bad thing, and practicing that and experiencing that can be helpful.
Yes, perfect.
Okay, last one.
How do I get through to my child when they won't make eye contact? Oh, so they might be like really involved in one of their preferred activities.
Yes, so we need to get rid of that preferred activity, pause the TV, take away electronics. And even for parents of teens, I know like I have lots of parents that have a screen time app and they can just like cut off the internet really quickly and do all that to make sure that they're really getting their kids' attention. Being in close proximity is super important. So if you're trying to get their attention from across the room, or better yet, like from the top of the stairs to the bottom of the stairs, that is not promoting good eye contact and listening. So making sure that you're within a couple of feet of your child when you're trying to get their attention. Some kids will respond really well to gentle touch. Some kids hate gentle touch. So you know your child best. If they don't like that, don't do it. But some kids and adults with ADHD can respond well to just maybe a gentle touch on the shoulder to help get their attention. I really love the phrase, "Can I see your eyes?" So I know that you're listening. I probably say that 10 times a day in my office. And then I give lots of praise. Oh, thank you for the eye contact. I really like it that you're listening and I know that you're paying attention. So really reinforcing when you do see that eye contact can be helpful. And then another tip and trick would be you can request a verbal repeat back. So, tell me what you're going to do now, or tell me what, we talked about. For kids who are really oppositional, that might not be best. But if it's really just being a space cadet and having trouble paying attention, that can be a helpful tool as well. And that's
Perfect.
all I have.
This was such fantastic information. We have just a few questions that came in through the Q&A pod. So Dr. Moody, are you okay if we have time just to answer one or two of those
Of
questions?
course. Yeah. And I'm happy if you wanted to email me too, I can make sure I respond to all of them.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. So um I think this one comes up a lot too. I work in the schools and I know this is a big one. So this person asked, what are your thoughts on use of fidget items while engaged to work to help with focus and tasks, and then balancing it further from like distracting a child? Like, so basically, how do you understand if a fidget becomes actually helps with focus or is more of a distraction?
That's a great question, especially in the height of when fidget spinners were really
Yeah.
popular. There's no evidence to support use of fidget spinners. So it's not something that I would recommend. But if your child does better with a fidget and it's not distracting and it's not disruptive, by all means, have them use it. So it's not an evidence-based tool, but if you know your child and it's helpful, do it.
Awesome. Yeah, it's just really figuring out what's going to work best for your own
Mhm.
individual kid. Mhm.
Right.
Uh, Another question that was asked was, what activities, and you talked a little bit about this, but what activities do you recommend for after school, maybe during that break time before they get into
Mhm.
schoolwork? So being sure that's not too overstimulating, but
Mhm.
wanting it to be a break time, but also not maybe being so overstimulating or like a really strong preferred activity where they have a hard time
Yeah.
getting back engaged in work.
I love a good snack. I feel like that's a good way to just like replenish and rejuvenate. And then anything that's like physical activity related is bonus points. So even just like going for a walk outside or walking around the house or walking the dog or practicing sports in the backyard or, anything that's not a highly preferred activity. Maybe it's even a chore, just something that can really help break things up. Maybe is about 15 to 30 minutes or so before you get started on schoolwork.
Wonderful. And if it's okay, I have just one last question for you
Okay.
that's really related to this. So for kids who are maybe hyperactive, even inattentive to when they have troubles with transition, so if maybe they take a break from homework, how do we get them to like allow them to take that break, but still effectively transition back
Mhm.
to like the thing that needs to get done, like a chore or homework?
Yeah, that's really hard. That's why we want to be mindful of not getting too far away from our area and not getting too entrenched in like a highly preferred activity. I think setting those expectations ahead of time can be really, really helpful. So to sit down with your kiddo and say, okay, we're going to do schoolwork for 15 minutes. We have the timer here. Once the 15 minutes is up, what do you want to do for your brain break? Do you want to play tic-tac-toe? Do you want to do jumping jacks? Do you want to listen to a song? Do you want to, walk the dog? Okay. And then we're going to come back and do, what do you want to do next? Do you want to do your math problems or do you want to do reading? So maybe giving them some choices too is another idea. But making sure they're not getting too far away, they're not getting too entrenched or involved in activities. And you're setting those expectations ahead of time.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Moody, for sharing all of your insight and expertise in how to support youth who have ADHD and just generally executive functioning concerns. I know I learned a lot and you gave some really awesome practical strategies. So thank you so, so much. All right, everybody. Thank you all so much for attending, and we're looking forward to seeing you at our future webinars. Take care,
Bye,
y'all.
everyone. Thank you.